The Vietnam War is a funny thing. The expression has become a household name and almost a major meme on the planet. But at the same time, can you tell why the conflict started and what the parties wanted? How did the war end? Don't worry now, we will do it all for you in the next couple of minutes. You will learn the meaning of the phrase Johnny, they are in the trees. Meet the charming Viet Cong and you will become an expert in any argument. Don't switch gears. Let's start by showing you Vietnam. On the map, it's an elongated country nestled under China and next to Thailand, the Philippines, and other hot resort destinations. These guys have never been boring even without the Americans. For 1,000 years of history, the days when peace reigned in Vietnam can be counted on fingers. But in 1857, France decided that the Vietnamese were not democratic enough and after a long war, made the country its colony, so it lasted until the end of World War II. But here it is worth noting an important fact: since 1860 in Vietnam was a powerful movement for independence and the beginning of the war in Vietnam can be considered. 1941. Why so early? It was then that Viet Minh was officially created, an organization led by Ho Chi Minh who wanted independence. At that time, on paper, Vietnam was still French, but was fully occupied by Japan. It was World War II, and it turned out to be a very funny situation. On the one hand, Vietnam fought against France, destroying its colonial army, and on the other hand, the Japanese also got under the crush. So in fact, in the Second World War, Vietnam was against everyone at the same time, which did not prevent the President of the United States from calling Ho Chi Minh a hero 20 years before he became enemy number one. In 1945, when Japan fell, the Viet Minh had only one enemy left: Vietnam's War of Independence against France, and a small British expeditionary force is called the First Indo-Chinese War. But to be honest, it was one protracted conflict because that's where the US came on the scene. Why? Because the above-mentioned Viet Minh was socialist to the last member. On September 2nd, 1945, the guys declared independence and the formation of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which on paper was communist. The Americans were not satisfied with the emergence of a powerful camp of socialists, so the guys helped the French in every possible way, with advisors, funding, and of course ammunition. The famous smell of napalm in the morning first tasted not American soldiers, but the French, because from 1945 to 54 years, they tried to maintain control over the colony. And in 1954, 10 years before the full-scale intervention of the US, already paid 80% of the cost. At the same time, the South remained under French control, but not for long. For here we come to the key point of the war, and it is that unlike the Koreans, the Vietnamese were united and did not want to be divided into two countries. They demanded elections, which were sort of scheduled for 1956, but it didn't work out. The US was too much of a communist pain in the ass. But it was the rednecks who were the main political force in Vietnam, the founder of the Viet Minh. Ho Chi Minh became president and the northern part of the country went on its merry way. Repression, executions, and other joys of life that accompanied communism around the world. According to various estimates, the Viet Minh killed between 5% and half of its population under pretenses, but it was supported even in the South. Already in 1957, in the rural areas of southern Vietnam, one after another communist uprisings began to erupt. It was the villagers who were the driving and most terrible military force because they had been fighting for generations with neighbors, with the French, with the Chinese. By the way, China was in a race with the USSR for influence on the communists of Vietnam and in general won it. But globally both countries opposed the U.S. and slowly supplied northern Vietnam with tanks, weapons, and specialists. Actually, this helped the DRV to get so strong that the communists began to look at the sweet southern lands, and as we have already mentioned, they were very much supported there, and not even for ideological reasons, but because the Vietnamese from the south felt themselves as a colony of the USA and allies. It was not South Korea, which quietly surrendered to the mercy of the victors. The Vietnamese from both sides wanted independence, and therefore the South Vietnamese government could not cope with the uprisings on its own. Since 1961, the U.S. moved troops to Vietnam, and 1965 is considered to be the year of the beginning of full-fledged military operations of the regular army of the Americans, and the year when the U.S. started a war that would be lost, General Norman Schwarzkopf calls it a mistake to send troops. It is true, because as we have remembered 1,000 times, the Vietnamese were united. What was happening in the country was considered a civil war, but when the Americans intervened, many Southerners fled to the north and became guerrillas against the U.S. As a result, not half of the country, but a good 2/3 of the country acted. 2.5 million Americans passed through Vietnam. Almost 60,000 of them died, more than 300,000 were wounded. In 1968, there were 550,000 soldiers in the country at the same time, and the average age of the dead was 23 years and 11 months. That is, the real color of the American nation fell in Vietnam. Why was it so? We are talking about the most powerful army of the planet, all because Norman Schwarzkopf was right. The National Front for the Liberation of South Vietnam, better known as Viet Cong. It's not a classic army, it's a 100,000 strong guerrilla force. The doctrine of search and destroy was adopted by the United States and Commander-in-Chief William Westmoreland. It implied active use of reconnaissance and burning out enemy units, as it is supposed to be in classical warfare. But the trouble is that there were no enemy units. The Viet Cong, and with it the Army of North Vietnam, for a long time used terror tactics. The American military police in the period from 60s to 70s recorded more than 1,000 terrorist attacks per month, and parallel with this, small groups of Vietnamese were literally everywhere. They dug tunnels, hid in trees, and slept in the mountains, because Vietnam is one big jungle and it is easy to hide there. Americans planned to fight with the regular army and screwed up and got thousands of guerrillas instead. They fought with everything from Japanese rifles of the Second World War to trophy German weapons, and excellent knowledge of the terrain combined with a total desire for independence did magical things. Take bombs, for example. During the Second World War, the Allies dropped 2,700,000 tons of bombs on Germany. Do you know how many bombs the US dropped on Vietnam in less than 10 years? 6,727,000, almost 3 times more, but the result was zero, because the scheme to find and destroy completely failed, and the further the situation got worse, North Vietnam began to help the Viet Cong with weapons, along the path passing through neighboring Laos, and along with this Viet Cong received Soviet, Chinese, and other types of equipment according to experts. It was the supply of Soviet anti-aircraft systems S-75 in many ways decided the outcome of the war, because they were very good against American aircraft, and in 1969 the US realized the mistakes and began to withdraw troops slowly. The reasons were many. First, there was no military progress. No one could not even approximately count the number of Viet Cong and where they are. Secondly, the Americans finally realized that the Vietnamese do not like interference in their affairs, and the US decided to switch to support the controlled army of South Vietnam well. And thirdly, the U.S. Army ceased to be combat ready. In 1970, 65 out of 335,000 military personnel in the country, 65 out of 335,000, and who are we to? As soon as the Americans did so, the Viet Cong and the Communist Army went on the offensive with mixed success, but South Vietnam, which had been practically deprived of American aid, fell. On April 30th, 1975, the Communists raised the banner over the Independence Palace in Saigon. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam officially won despite the fact that the whole world was against it. In addition to the US, South Vietnam was helped by South Korea, Australia, Japan, Taiwan, and others. The Viet Cong were actively and generously supported by their communist brothers. Soviet officer Mark Sternberg wrote about 4 divisions of Soviet fighter planes and pilot, under American names, fought with the Americans in the air. This is readily believable because the Cold War was at its peak, and the participation of 95 C-75 air defense systems with personnel is officially confirmed. Summarizing all of the above, I would like to note that to get involved in the squabbles of foreign countries is such an occupation. The key moment of the Americans losing the war was their participation in it. The footage of the withdrawal of troops still remains a strange page in the history of the U.S. Army, global history. It is another example of how the big uncles decided to play war on someone else's field. The civil conflict of a single country, it turned into a mini world war with a dozen countries on both sides, and according to the most conservative estimates, these games claimed 5 million lives, the overwhelming number of which were civilians. Civilians who can't tell the difference between communists and capitalists. Civilians who don't understand geopolitics and the interests of presidents. Civilians who just want to live and not die by evil irony. They are the ones who become the bargaining chips in global conflicts, and as modern history and the experience of Vietnam have not taught the planet anything, see you later, friends.